In the 1880s, at the very height of it, something close to 500 rafts of white pine came down the Mississippi River every single month. More than 300 million feet of timber a year, floating south on the open water. And for the first 20 years of this trade, there was not one engine pushing any of it. Men stood on islands of floating logs, acres of them, and rowed those islands 1,000 miles down the river, with oars longer than the boats they had come in on. The largest single raft ever built on that river stretched close to 5 acres across the water. And here is the part I cannot get out of my head. The treeless prairie towns of the lower Midwest, places that did not have a forest for hundreds of miles in any direction, were built almost entirely out of pine that had floated to them on the muscle and the balance of men whose names we almost never wrote down. I have been reading the old raft pilots' logs and the records of the Mississippi lumber trade, and I want to start with 2 real men, because they stood at the 2 ends of this whole story, and only one of them got remembered the way he should have. The first of them is a river pilot named Stephen Beck Hanks. He was born in 1821, and if the last name sounds familiar, it should. His family was the Hanks family of Kentucky, and Stephen Hanks was a first cousin of Abraham Lincoln. He saw his first steamboat in 1832 when he was 11 years old. Before he was 20, he was building flatboats and barges with his uncle on the riverbank at Albany, Illinois. And in 1842, at the very birth of the lumber business in the pine country of Minnesota, Stephen Hanks piloted one of the first floating lumber rafts all the way down to St. Louis. The next year, he took the first log raft safely out of Stillwater. He spent 50 years of his life on that river. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button, come back. The second man came at the trade from the opposite direction, not from the deck of a raft, but from the office of a sawmill. His name was Frederick Weyerhaeuser. He was born in Germany in 1834 and came to the United States in 1852 with very little to his name. By 1856, he was in Rock Island, Illinois, working for a lumber firm, and in 1860, he bought a sawmill there with his brother-in-law. From that one mill, he began buying up the pine forests of the Chippewa Valley, and within 20 years, he controlled the flow of logs down the whole upper river. By the time he died in 1914, people simply called him the Lumber King. So here are your 2 bookends again. One man who rode the logs down the river by hand, one man who came to own the forests they were cut from. And in between them, the thousands of raftsmen whose names the ledgers mostly kept as a wage and a check mark. This is their story. To understand why grown men would row a 5-acre island of logs down 1,000 miles of river, you have to understand a strange fact about the middle of this country. The great pine forests of America, the white pine especially, grew in the cold north, in Maine, and then in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. But the land that was filling up fastest with farmers and towns in the middle 1800s was the prairie, Iowa and Illinois and Missouri and the plains beyond, and the prairie had almost no trees worth cutting. A farmer on the Iowa prairie needed lumber for a house, a barn, a fence, a church, a store, a coffin, and there was no forest within reach to give it to him. The timber was hundreds of miles to the north. The customers were hundreds of miles to the south. And running directly between them, downhill, for free, was the Mississippi River. So the trade arranged itself around the water, exactly the way it had in Maine a generation before. In the winter, crews went deep into the pineries of the St. Croix, the Chippewa, the Black, and the Wisconsin River valleys and cut the great pines by hand. They hauled the logs to the frozen streams on ox and horse sleds and waited for spring. When the ice broke, they drove the logs down those smaller rivers to the Mississippi, the same dangerous river driving work I have described before. But here is where the Mississippi story becomes its own thing entirely. On a small, fast river, you drive loose logs. On the wide, slow, powerful Mississippi, you do something else. You gather the loose logs together, hundreds of thousands of them, and you build them into a single enormous raft, and you float the whole structure south as one piece. That building and that floating is the heart of this story. Let me give you a sense of the country this timber came from, because the scale of it is the whole point. The pine grew across a vast band of the cold north, and the cutting rose to a roar in the decades right after the Civil War. Whole river valleys were given over to it. The St. Croix on the border of Minnesota and Wisconsin, and the Chippewa, the Black, and the Wisconsin rivers cutting down through the Wisconsin pinelands. In the winter, the logging camps filled with men. The choppers felled the great white pines with axe and crosscut saw, and the teamsters hauled the logs over iced roads to the frozen streams, the same hard method the Maine woods used, only on a wilder and larger scale, because here the forest ran on for hundreds of unbroken miles. Every one of those logs was headed for the same place, the Mississippi, and from the Mississippi to a sawmill and a waiting customer somewhere out on the treeless prairie. The entire North Woods, in a sense, was tilted toward that one river. Putting a raft together was a craft of its own, and it started small. The men would take logs and fasten them inside a frame of poles called a crib, a unit about 16 feet by 32 feet. Then they would couple a dozen or more of those cribs end to end to make a long ribbon of logs called a string. And then they would lash several strings together, side by side, to make the finished raft. A full Mississippi raft might be 8 or 10 strings wide, each string 16 logs across and around 400 feet long. Put that together in your mind. A solid flexing field of floating timber, hundreds of feet wide and hundreds of feet long, 4 or 5 acres of pine, riding on a river. The men even had a word for the smaller bundles they floated out to build the big raft. They called them brails. And every bit of that assembly, the fastening, the coupling, the lashing, was done by hand, by men balancing on the logs in the water with poles and ropes and wooden pins. These great rafts were made up at gathering points along the upper river, places like the Street, Croy Boom above Stillwater, and the booms at the mouth of the Chippewa, where the loose logs of a whole winter's cut were caught, sorted, and built into rafts. The work ran with the open water season, from the spring break up through the fall, because once the river iced over, the rafting stopped cold. A crew might make several trips down and back in a single season, riding a raft south for hundreds of miles, then catching a steamboat north to do the whole thing over again. It was migratory work, and it drew a particular kind of man, young, strong, used to cold water and long hours, willing to live for weeks at a stretch on a moving field of logs far from any town. The river was their road, their workplace, and their home all at once. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. Now, how do you steer 4 acres of floating logs down a winding river? In the early years, before the 1860s, the answer was the most direct one imaginable. You did it with oars and with the strength of men. The raft floated on the current, and to keep it in the channel, to keep it from swinging sideways and grounding on a sandbar or smashing into the head of an island, the crew worked great steering oars called sweeps. These were not the oars you picture on a rowboat. A sweep on a Mississippi raft ran anywhere from 20 to 50 feet long. The men made them from young tamarack poles about a foot thick at the base, and set into the end a blade of pine about 14 inches wide and 12 feet long. Each string of the raft needed 2 oarsmen, one working a sweep at the front and one at the back. On a big raft, you might have a dozen or more men spread across the timber, hauling those enormous oars in rhythm, throwing their whole bodies into it, swinging a 5-acre raft a few feet at a time so it would round a bend without piling up on the bank. Think about what that actually demanded of a man. You are standing on a wet, shifting surface of logs, in the open weather, for weeks at a time. You are pulling on an oar longer than a telephone pole. You are doing it in the dark when you have to, because the river does not stop at night and a raft cannot pull over and park whenever it likes. The current sets your pace, and the current never tires. The men slept on the raft, ate on the raft, and lived on the raft, the same way the Maine drivers lived on the river, moving south at the speed of the water for hundreds of miles. The work was governed entirely by the river and by the muscle of the crew, and for the first 20 years of this trade that was the only power there was. There was a rough kind of domestic life out on the timber, too. A big raft carried a cook shanty, a little shack built right on the logs, where a cook worked a stove and fed the crew the heavy meals that hard physical labor demands. The men slept on the raft in shifts because the raft never stopped, and someone always had to be awake and on the sweeps, reading the river ahead in the dark. They watched the wind most of all. A loaded raft, 4 or 5 acres across, caught the wind like an enormous sail, and a hard crosswind at the wrong bend could shove the whole field of logs toward a sandbar or the head of an island, no matter how the men strained at the oars. So the crew read the sky, the water, and the banks without ever quite stopping, and the best raftsmen built up an almost unconscious sense of where the current would carry a raft long before it got there. And the river was patient, but it was not safe. The upper Mississippi had two stretches that every raftsman feared, two sets of rapids, where the wide, lazy river suddenly narrowed and quickened and turned shallow and rocky. The first was the Upper Rapids, a run of about 15 miles just above Rock Island, Illinois. The second was the Lower Rapids, also called the Des Moines Rapids, about 11 miles of fast, broken water just above Keokuk, Iowa. At normal river levels, these rapids were a wall in the path of any raft, a loose, flexing, 5-acre island of logs that handled slowly at the best of times now had to be threaded through a narrow, rocky, racing channel without breaking apart or grounding or tearing itself to pieces. It took a very particular kind of man to do it. When it went wrong on a grand scale. A raft that struck a rock or swung broadside in the fast water could break its lashings and come apart. And once that happened, the river took over. Loose logs would scatter for miles downstream, driving up onto islands and bars and piling against bridge piers. And a winter's worth of one man's timber could be strung out along the banks where it had to be gathered up log by log all over again, if it could be gathered at all. Men were hurt in these wrecks, caught between shifting logs or thrown into cold, fast water, the same way they were on the main drives. And the same brutal truth applied here. A man on a breaking raft in the middle of a rapid had very little margin and very little help. So the crews approached those two stretches of water with real fear, and the arrival of a skilled rapids pilot at the head of the run was the most welcome sight on the whole trip. That man was the rapids pilot, and he was a specialist worth his weight in pine. In the early days, there were 5 rapids pilots living in the little town of LeClaire, Iowa, and their entire job was to take rafts over the Rock Island Rapids. A through pilot bringing a raft down from the pineries would stop above the rapids, take on one of these local experts who knew every rock and every eddy in that 15-mile run, and let him steer the raft through the worst of it before handing it back. The knowledge lived in those men's heads, and nowhere else. There were no detailed charts a man could simply read. The pilot carried the river in his memory, the way the main boom men could read a log mark like handwriting, and when the water was wrong or the wind came up at the wrong moment, all of that knowledge stood between the crew and a wreck. Then I tell you what happened next, but first, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories like this one unless enough people click. One click. Come back. This is where Stephen Hanks earns his place at the front of this story. When he took that first lumber raft down to St. Louis in 1842, almost none of this knowledge existed yet. There were no 5 rapids pilots waiting at LeClaire, no established channels, no accepted way of doing the thing. He and a handful of others were inventing the craft as they went, learning the river one dangerous run at a time, finding out by trial and by near disaster how to move a giant raft through water that had never carried one before. He was one of only 2 men, for a time, running rafts under contract, which is to say one of only 2 men the mill owners trusted to get the wood through. He did it from 1842 until the middle of the 1850s, and then he made the jump that the whole industry would eventually make. He stepped off the hand-rowed raft and onto the deck of a steamboat, piloting packet boats for the Minnesota Packet Company and the Diamond Joe Line. The man helped invent the hand era, and then he lived right into the machine era that replaced it. A good raft pilot was one of the best paid and most respected working men on the whole river, and he earned every bit of it. He was responsible for a cargo worth a fortune and for the lives of every man riding the raft, and he had nothing to work with but the current, the wind, his crew, and what he carried in his own head. There were no second chances at the rapids. A pilot who put a raft on the rocks above Rock Island could scatter a winter's worth of somebody's timber across 15 miles of river and ruin men who were counting on that wood to live through the year. Stephen Hanks built his name on the simple fact that, trip after trip, he brought the wood through. In a trade with almost no room for error, that was the highest thing a man could be. Because the machine was coming, and it came from a boat shop in that same little town of LeClaire. For 2 decades, the rafts had run on muscle alone, and the limits of muscle were real. A raft that could only be steered by oars could not be stopped quickly, could not be backed up, could not fight a hard wind, and needed a small army of strong men on every trip. In the 1860s, a LeClaire boat builder named Samuel Van Sant, a man who would one day become the governor of Minnesota, built one of the first steamboats designed for nothing but pushing and steering log rafts. The raft boat changed everything. Instead of a crew hauling sweeps for 1,000 miles, a single steamboat lashed to the back of the raft could push it, turn it, hold it against the wind, and drive it through the night under its own power. Within a generation, the great sweep oars were gone, and the men who had pulled them were gone with them, replaced by a boiler and a paddle wheel. The hand era of the Mississippi rafts, the era this video is really about, lasted only about 20 years before the machine took it. Even the steamboat did not fully solve the steering problem at first. A single boat, lashed behind a raft, could push it. But swinging a quarter-mile of loose timber around a sharp bend was more than one rudder could manage. So the rafters added a second, smaller steamboat at the front, called a bow boat, whose entire job was to nose the head of the raft around the curves, while the big boat pushed from behind. A great rafting outfit in the later years might run a raft the size of several city blocks with a powerful steamer at the stern and a nimble bow boat at the front, the two of them working the timber down the river like a team of horses pulling a heavy wagon. It was clever, and it was a long way from a line of men hauling tamarack sweeps in the rain. But it did the same job the oarsmen had done, only bigger and faster, and with far fewer hands. But the trade itself did not shrink when the machine arrived. It exploded. With steamboats pushing them, the rafts grew to sizes that would have been unthinkable in the oar days. Remember the numbers from the start. At the peak in the 1880s, about 500 rafts of white pine a month came down the river, and more than 300 million feet of timber a year. The largest log raft ever assembled was put together at Lynxville, Wisconsin in 1896. It measured 270 feet wide and 1,550 feet long, and it held 2.25 million feet of timber. A few years later, in 1901, the largest lumber raft ever floated started out on Lake Street, Croy. 270 feet wide and 1,450 feet long, carrying 9 million feet of sawn lumber in a single floating load. These were not rafts anymore in any ordinary sense. They were floating fields, the size of a small farm, moving down the spine of the continent. To watch one of these rafts pass must have been something to see. Picture a field of pine the size of several farms sliding down the brown water past a river town, a steamboat smoking at the stern, a smaller one nosing at the bow, and a scatter of men living out on the logs with a little shack for a kitchen. Children ran down to the banks to watch them go by. For 2 full generations, the rafts were simply part of the scenery of the upper Mississippi, as ordinary and as awesome as a freight train would later become on the open plains. And every single one of them was a forest in transit, a piece of the North Woods on its slow way to becoming the walls and floors and fences of a town that had no trees of its own. One quick note, I turned the full story of the Mississippi lumber rafts into a book, Everything the Records Gave Me. If you want it, the link is in the description. All of that timber had to be gathered and sorted somewhere before it could be rafted, and that brings us to a place called Beef Slough, and to the harder, colder side of this business. Beef Slough was a side channel of the Mississippi near the mouth of the Chippewa River, and it became the great sorting yard of the upper trade. Logs came down the Chippewa from dozens of different owners, each log stamped with its owner's mark, all of them mixed together in the water. And at Beef Slough they had to be caught, held, sorted by mark, and built into rafts bound for the Wright Mills downriver. At its height, the operation was handling millions of logs and employing more than 1,500 men. It was loud, wet, dangerous, around-the-clock work, men running on floating logs in a crowded boom, sorting timber by hand, and almost none of those 1,500 men left us their names. And the rafts had destinations, real places that grew rich, sawing them up. All down the upper Mississippi, river towns turned themselves into sawmill cities to catch the timber drifting past. Places like Winona and La Crosse, Dubuque and Clinton, Davenport and Rock Island, and farther south, the great market at St. Louis. A raft that began as standing pine in a Wisconsin forest might be caught at one of these towns, run through a screaming mill, and turned into finished boards within days, then shipped out by wagon and rail to a farm that had been waiting on it for a year. Whole cities along that river were built on the plain business of turning northern logs into prairie lumber, and when the pine finally ran out, some of those towns very nearly died with it. Beef Slough is also where the gentle-sounding word trade turns into the word war. The Chippewa Valley held some of the finest pine in the country, and 2 groups wanted to control how it moved. The local Chippewa lumbermen wanted to keep the logs and saw them in their own valley. The mill owners down on the Mississippi, led by Frederick Weyerhaeuser, wanted those logs floated down to their own mills at places like Rock Island. In 1870, Weyerhaeuser and a group of Mississippi millmen organized the Mississippi River Logging Company and took over the boom and sorting rights at Beef Slough. What followed was about 10 years of legal and commercial fighting that the histories remember as the Beef Slough War. It was a war fought with lawsuits, contracts, dams, and pressure rather than with guns. But the stakes were enormous, the control of an entire region's timber. By 1880, Weyerhaeuser's side had won, and the Chippewa lumbermen had been forced to come to terms. From then on, an astonishing share of the white pine in the upper Midwest moved at the word of one man and the company he had built. I want to be careful here, the same way I always try to be, because it would be easy to turn this into a simple story of a powerful man versus the little guys, and the truth is more interesting than that. Weyerhaeuser did organize the trade, and he did profit enormously, but the thing he organized was genuinely chaotic and wasteful before him, with rival crews fighting over mixed-up logs in the water. And the men who actually did the work, the choppers in the winter woods, the drivers on the Chippewa, the sorters at Beef Slough, the oarsmen and pilots on the great rafts, they worked the same brutal hours and took the same risks no matter whose name was on the company. The real adversary in this story was never really another lumberman. It was the river, the rapids, the wind, the cold, and the sheer scale of trying to move a forest across half a country. And it was time. Because the one thing nobody in the trade wanted to believe was that the pine could ever run out. It ran out. That is the quiet tragedy under all these enormous numbers. People had called the northern pineries inexhaustible, an endless supply, and for 50 years the saws and the rafts treated them that way. But a forest is not actually endless, and by the early 1900s, the great white pine of Minnesota and Wisconsin was largely cut. The mills that had roared for decades began to fall silent. The rafts came less often, and then rarely, and then almost not at all. There was simply no more big pine to float. The trade that had built 1,000 prairie towns had, in a way, floated its own forests away. And so we come to the ending. And it is one of the most fitting endings I have ever come across in any of these stories. In 1915, the very last raft of lumber came down the Mississippi, the end of a trade that had run since the 1830s. The raft was brought down behind a steamboat called the Ottumwa Belle. And as the Ottumwa Belle came down the river with that final raft, it stopped at the town of Albany, Illinois, the very place where, more than 70 years before, a young man had once built flatboats with his uncle on the riverbank. The boat stopped to take aboard an honored guest. It was Stephen Beck Hanks, the cousin of Abraham Lincoln, the pilot who had taken one of the first rafts down to St. Louis back in 1842. He was 94 years old. The man who had been present at the birth of the great rafting era rode down the river at its death, on the last raft, as a guest of honor. He died 2 years later, in 1917. I find it hard to imagine a cleaner circle than that. The whole era of the hand-floated forests fits between the two ends of one old riverman's life. When Hanks died, the living memory of the ore era was very nearly gone with him. After that, it survived only in a handful of places, in the pilot's logs, in the photographs of those impossible 5-acre rafts, in a few good books like Walter Blair's Raft Pilot's Log, and in the towns themselves, because here is the thing we so rarely stop to think about. If you walk through an old neighborhood in Iowa or Illinois or Missouri, and you see a farmhouse or a barn or a church built in the 1870s or 1880s out of clear white pine, there is a real chance that wood grew in a northern forest, was cut by hand in winter, was floated down a wild tributary, was sorted at a place like Beef Slough, was built into a raft 4 acres across, and was rowed and then pushed down 1,000 miles of the Mississippi to get to that spot. The prairie was built out of the North Woods, and the river was the road that carried it. That is what gets me about this whole story. We tend to picture the settling of the American Midwest as a thing that happened on land, with wagons and plows and railroads. But a huge part of it happened on the water, floating, and it happened on the backs of men, with names like the 5 Rapids pilots of LeClaire, men who could thread a 5-acre raft through 11 miles of rock at Keokuk and never put it on a stone. We remember Weyerhaeuser because he ended up owning the forests. We remember Hanks because he happened to be Lincoln's cousin, and a writer thought to put him down on the last raft. But the oarsman who pulled a 50-foot sweep in the rain for 300 miles so that a family in Iowa could have a barn, we do not know him at all. The ledger kept him as a wage. The river kept nothing. Here is the thought I will leave you with, and you can tell me in the comments whether you think I have it right. We give the credit for settling the prairie to the farmer with the plow and the railroad man with the rails. But I have come to believe that the towns of the lower Midwest were really built by the men on the rafts, the ones who floated whole forests down 1,000 miles of river with oars and muscle before a single engine ever touched the work. They did it for about 20 years before the machine took over. And in those 20 years, they figured out how to move a forest by hand. The pine they floated is still standing today, in 10,000 old houses and barns across a treeless prairie, holding up roofs over people who have no idea their walls came down the Mississippi on the strength of a forgotten man's arms. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from Boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.